kind of have a soft spot for the end of the year. As things wind down, it makes for the perfect time to reflect on what worked and didn't work from last year, and to look optimistically to the future. It also means awards season, and at least for me, catching up on all the shows from the last year that I didn't quite get around to while they were airing. This way, when I make my best of year video, I can have an informed reason for ignoring all the popular ones. And hey, since a man's gotta secure his bag every so often, and year-end festivities seem to be on everyone's mind, there's no point in really going against the currents. To cap this year off, I'm gonna change the rules ever so slightly. Instead of picking 3 random anime, I've instead selected 3 shows from the last year that didn't quite make the cut for my shortlist, but that I think might have enough merit on their own to warrant a watch nonetheless. Consider this a sort of last-minute qualifier for that bigger video. Other than that, the rules are the same. You get 3 episodes to grab my attention, and if you don't, you're going straight to the drop list and get a front row seat to all the better series that actually did make the cut. You've really got no one to blame but yourself at that point. When we talk about the shifting landscape of anime, it's hard not to bring up the sad state of modern shoujo. Once a dominant genre with the likes of magical girls in the 90s and the golden age of rom-coms in the 2000s, shoujo anime have largely been absent from the conversation across the past decade, with most of the remaining audience being consolidated into big shonen titles with their array of sexy boys. Still, with the recent rise of the shonen rom-com and renewed interest in fantasy that aren't just your cardboard cutout isekai story, interest in a shoujo resurgence feels like it's at an all-time high. Winter Sugar Apple Fairy Tale offered a solid hook and a distinct visual style, but felt just a tad too melodramatic for its own good. But never fear, because not even a season later, another title will try its hand at revitalizing the genre. Sacrificial Princess and the King of Beasts is a shoujo fantasy story reminiscent of the likes of 2017's The Ancient Magus Bride and last year's The Girl from the Other Side. It tells the story of a little orphan girl named Seraphi, who has been selected as the latest sacrifice to Leonhardt, the King of Beasts. Lucky for both this sweet little snowflake and the plot, it turns out that the king isn't really that bad a guy, resulting in him sparing Seraphi and keeping her under his care. This obviously sends shockwaves throughout the kingdom, but you kinda get the idea. I imagine much like Odd Taxi and Beastars before it, Sacrificial Princess turned a lot of people away with its anthropomorphic designs and romance subplot that seemed perfectly catered to a very specific fandom. I'll admit I myself wasn't immune to this thought process either, and given the state of shoujo, quickly wrote this off as another quick name to forget, but months of whispered murmurs later, and I finally decided to give it a shot. Sacrificial Princess carves a nice niche for itself with its softer style and approach to world building. Its dynamic is mildly reminiscent of the other shows I mentioned earlier, but feels much more like Snow White with the red-white hair in tone and pacing. The Beauty and the Beast plot isn't anything novel, but what girl doesn't yearn for a tall stoic man for them to fix? Hey, a man can dream. With a beefy 24-episode runtime, Sacrificial Princess appears to have the length to take its ideas and run with it. The hook isn't quite as standout as some of its contemporaries, but it shows early signs of an actual narrative arc that could comfortably hold itself across that runtime and make the show a standout title among the many conceptual shows of the year. At worst, it can certainly fall back on its charming protagonist and sweet vibes, but with as much as it has on the table, I feel like such an outcome would be disappointing. Don't really want another Sugar Apple Fairy Tale on my hands. Oh, you thought I could go a month without talking about harem comedies? How naive. Man, even when I select my own series for these videos, it seems I keep crawling back to this godforsaken genre. However, even I have to admit that, much like shoujo fantasy, it isn't exactly as prominent as it once was. Hardcore ecchi shows seem to largely fall out of favor by the mid-2010s, as isekai picked up steam as the go-to trash genre of choice. And besides a few horny redditors, I don't think anyone really minded. A couple series certainly have popped up though, most notably Interspecies Reviewers back in 2020, and more recently last summer's Temple. As a callback to the 2000s era of ecchi rom-coms, Temple is as unapologetic as it gets. Following the story of Akamitsu Akagame, son of a famous prude who swears off women entirely after a run-in with a local babe starts to severely affect his studies. Turning to Buddhism for help, Akamitsu joins a local temple to aid in his noble efforts, only to, through a convoluted series of events, end up serving in a nunnery full of bodacious women, including the girl who kicked off this whole ordeal. Yeah, that's a about as shameless as it gets, and Temple is more than willing to embrace all of it. Despite his and the residents' best efforts, each attempt of the girl to get Akamitsu out of the nunnery only leads to more comically inconvenient and compromising positions, brought on largely through their own incompetence. The series runs around at a mile a minute from gag to gag, with only the breaks afforded by the OP and ED giving much ground to slow the pace at all down. That does end up working in the series' favor though, as it hides many of the series' overall shortcomings. The animation and art feel inconsistent, and the overall presentation quite flat. The girls themselves fall largely into common archetypes of the genre and end up being fairly forgettable as a consequence. That's not to say you can't play into these kinds of tropes, especially when you embrace so much else of the genre, but Temple doesn't really do anything to really justify it, making it feel more like a failing of the author than some clever homage. It also doesn't really need to be said, but boob gags are everywhere in this show, and if that isn't your cup of tea, well, you probably weren't that interested in this one anyway. Overall, the series is sure not anime of the year, but it does steer clear away from the more morally dubious joke setups of the genre, and through its manic energy, does feel like an earnest attempt to replicate the better elements of the once prominent genre without as much of the negative. Whether one can stomach 12 full episodes is going to come down to how quickly it can adapt and prevent the gag from getting old, but it's got more fundamentals in place than most of the shows it emulates, so maybe we're onto something. I know those horny Redditors will be elated. From shoujo to smut to workplace romance, man, we're really running the whole gamut here, aren't we? It is not particularly hard to see similarities among the new wave of shonen rom-coms. Most will all take place in middle or high school as is part of the course, and typically focus on a single gimmick relationship that, for better or worse, stalls out halfway through and limps its way across the finish line. 2023, though, has been a pretty good year for the genre, all things considered. We did bid adieu to Kaguya, at least for now, but plenty of other titles have arisen that show plenty of promise. Skipping low for Insomniacs After School and The Dangers of My Heart more immediately come to mind, but even lesser works like Loving Yamada at level 999 still had more development than the bigger shows from years prior, so progress? There are hordes of series to go through here, believe me, and there is little chance I make it to all of them by the end of the year, but maybe a little workplace romance wouldn't be too bad a shakeup. Could certainly cleanse my palate at the very least. With one of the longer names from the year, the ice guy and his cool female colleague follows the romance between two new office workers, Fuyutsuki and Himuro. The former, a woman who shows little emotion, and the latter, a literal ice spirit. Yeah, that whole ice guy bit wasn't just hyperbole. Yeah, this isn't your granddad's Wodokoi, this one has actual fantasy elements woven into its story. Oh, and Himuro certainly isn't alone here either, as there are several other spirits, namely fox girls, for your viewing pleasure. Ice Guy does differentiate itself from its contemporaries with a much slower and down-to-earth atmosphere that pairs well with its more vibrant color palette than shows going for similar effects. The comedy is rather restrained and fits the show and its characters well, and since I don't seem to be getting any more Wodokoi soon, this show will have to suffice. Where Ice Guy does struggle is in its glacial pacing. If Kaguya asks what if two tsunderes fell for one another, then Ice Guy asks what if two dandares fell for one another, and the result is about as you'd expect. The small touches of the romance are nice, but the show gives the air that it doesn't want to go much of anywhere anytime soon. This is further compounded by the fact that its single joke of choice wears off pretty quickly. The whole "he's an ice guy and causes blizzards when his emotion flares up" feels limited, and the show doesn't do much with it besides a couple basic gags, and the presence of more couples in the OP seems to indicate that instead of developing that relationship, the show will instead opt to just throw more characters at the wall and shake things up in typical fashion. Still, it's got more going for it than the likes of Ahiron last year, and has a much stronger core relationship, and doesn't seem to necessarily be building to the same trite confession at the end like everything else does. Which is kind of assuming it's building to much of anything at all, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. With the shoujo anime market existing as a shadow of its former self, it is inspiring to get a title like Sacrificial Princess that shows what has been lost along the way, as well as some things worth leaving in the past. While seeing the series to completion wasn't too hard an ask, Even for a two-core show, the series does struggle at times to bring novelty to its revolving assortment of arcs. There are some strong underlying themes and ideas to still explore, but the plot can at times fall back on the same "someone is trying to dethrone the king and it is up to Seraphine to solve the problem because she's a good person" plot point. Still, the strong Egyptian imagery is a fresh change of pace for a fantasy setting, and a strong ending manages to wrap up most of the major threads in a satisfying way that almost justifies the lack of diverse plotlines. If you're a big fan of shoujo, there is certainly worse out there. Temple has to be one of the most mixed bags I have ever watched, but watch it I did. It has a strong grasp on what makes the harems of old work, and does a fine job of keeping things going with its brisk pace. However, its comedy is very reliant on a lot of tired gags, and the heavy emphasis on dirty humor can become grating if and when the jokes don't land. Besides that, its characters are still uncharacteristically weak, even for the genre, and most fail to leave much of an impression. Still, when it works, and if you're looking to scratch that etchy itch, you won't be dissatisfied. Lastly, Ice Guy and his cool female colleague sure was able to differentiate itself in a sea of adolescent comedies, but that still wasn't enough to justify seeing it through to the end. Even by episode 3, its reliance on a solitary gag didn't instill a whole lot of confidence that it would ever move past that, and with the idea that my time would be better spent elsewhere, I cast it aside to the drop list. There's just too many other better romances out there to spend my time on. With that, I hope you enjoyed the video and this series at large thus far. It's been a lot of fun to make, and I hope to keep improving it come the new year. As always, if you like what you see, remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and so you don't miss my top 10 anime of 2023 that'll be coming out some point in the near future. Comment down below what you think I can do to improve the series moving forward, and as always, feel free to follow me at the sites below. Until next time, always remember to stay salty.